kind of the goal in psychology in regards to personality is understanding, first of all, like how does personality develop across the lifespan, like what contributes to someone developing a particular personality versus a different one, and then also like how do we classify all these different personality traits, which I guess that already kind of gets into some of the key takeaways I want you to take from today. So we're going to talk about personality kind of, from a historical perspective, like starting with some of the earliest theorists that tried to describe personality and then like work our way up to more modern theories. And the early theories really focused on that developmental aspect. So, people like Freud will be one that we'll talk quite a bit about. Really his main focus was trying to understand like how did particular personalities develop over the lifespan. So how did, certain things in the childhood contribute to that adulthood personality? And then the more modern approaches really focus more on how can we classify all these different types of personalities into some sort of structure that will be useful for research purposes, essentially. So those will be kind of the two topics that we talk about over the course of history. And then we'll end by talking just a little bit about this idea that personality traits vary across cultures. So, a lot of the research that was done, especially historically, didn't necessarily take that aspect into account. They just kind of talked about personality as like this universal thing, that it would apply to everyone. But it turns out that there's, quite a bit of cultural differences in terms of like, the specific personality traits that people are likely to have. Okay, so we're going to start off with Freud. I talked a tiny bit about Freud in our very first class or whatever, we talked about history, and I think I made my opinions of him a little bit clear. But before we go into this, I just do want to give a little bit of a caveat that Freud is, he's probably the most well-known person in the field of psychology, and often considered kind of like the father of modern-day therapy. And he made pretty huge contributions to the field. But he also, a lot of his methods were very questionable. He did not take a very scientific approach in the way that he developed these theories, which I'll kind of talk about as we get into some of the specific aspects of it. He also, he tended to focus very heavily on things like sex and aggression, and kind of had this idea that those are like the two driving forces of everything. And there's a lot of research that suggests that that's probably not true for most people. He also, I think I mentioned this on the first day, he was a cocaine addict for a very large portion of his, adult life. He thought cocaine was like this miracle drug, basically, used it himself a lot for, basically like the euphoric feelings, but also kind of as a way, he looked at it almost as a way to like unlock memories in his mind that he wouldn't otherwise be able to access. And he died, I think he died of some sort of like oral cancer, which might have had, something like his cocaine use might have contributed to that. So he had a pretty serious addiction for a lot of his life. So just kind of take all that, in the back of your mind as we're talking about Freud and his contributions. But Freud developed what is called the psychodynamic perspective, or sometimes called the psychoanalytic method of therapy, basically. And there's a lot that Freud talked about. He was really prolific for a really long period of time, and we're not going to cover everything that he introduced, but we'll go over kind of like some of the highlights, and I'll end by telling you the stuff that kind of still, maybe seems to be true to today, even though a lot of it is not. So one of the, big ideas that Freud had that he contributed to the field was the idea of the conscious and the unconscious. So he was the first to kind of come up with this concept that a lot of our actions and behaviors are driven by these unconscious mechanisms, which are things that we don't really have access to. Like, we're not aware of all this unconscious thinking that goes on in our minds. And that the conscious part, the part that we are aware of, is just this really tiny sliver of our actual experience. He also developed these ideas of the id, the ego, and the superego. You all have probably heard the word ego a lot in your lives. So that's, one of the main contributions that still kind of sticks around today from what he talked about. But basically the idea here is that you're born with what's called the id. And the id is this very primitive, selfish, greedy kind of part of our brain or our mind. The id basically just wants, very hedonic, selfish kind of pleasures, basically. So if it was up to the id, we would basically spend all of our lives just like having sex and eating whatever kind of food we want. And if we're angry, the id would basically just want to be like super violent and aggressive. So it's this really like primitive, selfish part of our mind, basically. And then over time, throughout our childhood, we develop the superego and the ego. So the superego is kind of like the counterweight to the id. The superego is basically like our conscience that tells us what is right and wrong, and tries to kind of stop the id from doing all of its selfish, terrible things, basically. And then the ego is kind of like the mediator between those two. The ego is the part that actually makes the decisions and acts, but it does that by taking into account what the id and the superego want, okay? So, you know, like this morning, you woke up at 8 or whatever, you're trying to decide if you want to go to class. Your id is probably like, no, I want to sleep more. I want to stay home and play video games. Your superego is like, well, you know, class is really important. You should go. Your instructor's going to be mad if you don't go. You know, and then your ego is the one that like takes both of those and then actually makes a decision to get up and get dressed and come to class. Freud basically thought that, you know, all conflict, all of our like inner issues, like mental issues, come from us not being able to resolve the id and the superego effectively. So if you have a strong, healthy ego, then it's going to be able to take the information from the id and the superego, and it's going to be able to resolve it and make good, healthy decisions. But if you have a weak ego, an ego that's unhealthy, then it's going to, you know, not be able to resolve that effectively. It might listen to the id too much. So someone who has a dominant id is going to, you know, suffer from like addictions, narcissism, but also someone might suffer from having an overly dominant superego. So someone with a dominant superego, they basically don't ever allow themselves to give in to like, you know, pleasures or whatever. So, you know, they might be like too strict basically with themselves and with other people. So his whole thing is like, you need to have a healthy, well-balanced ego. He also thought that basically the role of the therapist is to model a healthy ego. So you have your patients come in, they talk through whatever their issues are, and the job of the therapist is to kind of act as like the healthy ego that's going to help your client, you know, balance their id and their superego effectively. So that was kind of core to like a lot of his ideas and to the way that he, you know, sort of developed his approaches to therapy. I'll also say, so one of the really unscientific things about Freud is that he came up with a lot of these ideas based off of a patient that he never actually saw. So Freud was a physician. He wasn't really a psychologist. I don't think psychology was really a thing back then because he was basically the founder of it. So he was a physician. There was another physician he worked with that had a patient that went by the pseudonym Anna O. And Anna O had all these symptoms of what they called it back then was hysteria. And hysteria was basically these like, you know, symptoms of like emotional instability, things like that. So Anna O was suffering from hysteria. This other physician basically told Freud, like, oh, this patient comes in and she'll talk to me about her symptoms, and then once she's talked about it, she feels better. And so Freud kind of had the idea from hearing that secondhand that like maybe just talking through things would be a good, you know, form of treatment or therapy. So that's kind of what started his ideas of talk therapy, but it's from a patient that he never even actually saw himself. Okay. So Freud, like I said, he thought that all of, you know, human issues could be described based on the conflicts between those, you know, the id, the ego, and the superego, and how well you resolve them. And he also came up with this idea of defense mechanisms, which defense mechanisms are things that we use whenever we can't successfully resolve the id and the superego. Then we use these defense mechanisms to basically like defend ourselves from the damage that could potentially cause. So he came up with these 8 different defense mechanisms. Some of them are kind of obvious, so I'll describe what each one is, especially the ones that maybe you haven't heard of before. So one of the defense mechanisms is just denial. So like if your id wants something that your superego knows is really bad, and you give in and you let the id have that thing, like, you know, maybe you're an alcoholic or something like that, and you just like let your id run wild and just drink as much as you want. One way to deal with that is just to deny it, to basically lie to yourselves and others and say like, no, this isn't happening. So denial is one of the defense mechanisms. The second one is displacement, which displacement is basically when you take an emotion that you have towards one thing and you displace it onto something else. So like maybe, you go to work and your boss is a jerk, so you're mad at your boss, but then you go home and you take that anger out on the people around you, on your roommates or your family members. So you're sort of forcing that anger onto someone who didn't cause it. That's called displacement. Another defense mechanism is what's called projection. Projection is when you have done something yourself that you're probably ashamed of or you feel guilty about, but you accuse other people of doing that same thing, right? So if I cheated on a test, I might accuse a classmate of cheating on the test because I feel bad about it. So that's projection. Rationalization is basically just trying to come up with a logical reason for why you did the thing that you did, trying to make it sound like it was logical, like it was the right thing to do. Reaction formation is basically, this one for whatever reason I always mix up with another one, so let me make 100% sure before I say it that I'm saying the right thing. Yeah, so reaction formation is essentially kind of like hypocrisy, basically. It's like acting in ways that are counter to your own actual beliefs. So if you have a friend who really likes to party and drink and you think that that's wrong, but then you go out and party and drink with them anyways, or you condone their partying and drinking and say it's cool, even though you yourself believe that it's bad, that would be an example of reaction formation. Regression is another defense mechanism where you basically revert back to your childhood tendencies or to less mature, patterns of behavior than kind of your current level, basically. Repression is where you basically just forget about it. I'm just going to bury this, pretend that it never happened. And then sublimation is where you basically take something that you're ashamed of or you feel guilty about, but you find a socially appropriate way to kind of vent that emotion. I think your textbook gave a pretty good example where let's say, someone you love died from a car accident from a drunk driver. So this drunk driver caused your loved one to die. Maybe you feel lots of violence and aggression and anger towards that drunk driver. And it would be socially unacceptable to do anything based on that revenge, but you might find a socially acceptable route for those emotions. Maybe you join, group therapies, or maybe you join some of the groups that try to reduce drunk driving. So that would be sublimation. So Freud, one of his main contributions that I think still sticks around are these defense mechanisms. These are still, talked about quite a bit by psychologists. Often in therapy, you might talk through you're using these defense mechanisms to continue your addiction, or these defense mechanisms are contributing to your depression or your anxiety or whatever. So that's, one of the pieces that I think still sticks around from some of Freud's theories. Okay, more relevant to our discussion though on personality. So Freud really thought that personality develops over the course of the first 12 years of life, based on how we function through these different stages of psychosexual development. So again, remember, Freud thought that everything was basically about sex and aggression. So he also thought that a lot of the way our personalities developed are based off of how we sort of develop sexually up until basically adolescence, essentially. So Freud theorized that there are these 5 different stages that we go through from birth to about 12 years. And that at each stage we have, first of all, there is what's called an erogenous zone. The erogenous zone is the part of the body that we derive pleasure from. So at each stage, that erogenous zone is kind of shifting around a little bit. Also at each stage, there's kind of a conflict that we have to resolve that's related to that erogenous zone. And if we resolve that conflict successfully, and we do that for all 5 stages, then by the end of it, by the time we get to 12, we're going to have a fully developed, healthy ego. But if something goes wrong in any of those 5 stages, then that's going to contribute to an unhealthy ego and to a misbalance between the id and the superego. So these are the 5 stages that he described. So the first is called the oral stage. So this is from birth to 1 year. And according to Freud, during this time, our erogenous zone is the mouth. That's why it's called the oral stage. So during this time, according to Freud, we derive pleasure basically from from the mouth, putting things in our mouth, sucking on things, eating things. And the way that we resolve that conflict or resolve that stage is by successfully weaning from like the bottle or the breast. So if you can successfully, without any trauma or major issues, go from drinking breast milk or bottled milk to solid foods, then you will overcome the oral stage and move on to the next stage. Next stage is the anal stage, which I'm guessing you can probably guess what the erogenous zone is here. So it would be the anus in this case. The way that this stage is resolved is through successful potty training, basically, like learning to control our own bowels, to be able to go to the bathroom, on our own. Then we enter the phallic stage, which is when the pleasure, focus shifts basically to the genitals. So during the phallic stage, we start to derive pleasure from that area of the body. And this one is really wild. A lot of these stages are like, crazy, but the phallic stage, according to Freud, the way that we resolve it is by overcoming what he called the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex. You guys ever heard those terms before? Okay, yeah. So for those of you who haven't, the Oedipus complex is this idea that Freud came up with, that all boys during the phallic stage are secretly in love with their mothers, and they want to basically take the role of their father. So they have a lot of like anger and aggression towards their fathers because they're in love with their mothers. And the way that they overcome this stage is by basically resolving that, by accepting that like they cannot be with their mother, but that if they kind of mimic the behaviors of their father, then eventually they can be with a woman that's like their mother. Okay? So that's how boys overcome the phallic stage. I think actually Freud didn't talk about girls in this stage, but later other theorists, I think it was Jung, that contributed the Electra complex, which the Electra complex is kind of like the Oedipus complex in reverse. So little girls are supposedly in love with their fathers and want to take the role of their mothers. Jung also added that little girls have what's called penis envy. So he thought that girls are angry at their mothers because their mothers didn't give them a penis. And so in order to overcome the phallic stage, they have to basically overcome that like anger. So phallic stage of Freud, probably the one that we can like definitely like just throw that out. None of that is true. There's no evidence that anything I just said is actually true. So you can just forget all of that. That'd be perfectly fine with me. Then according to Freud, we enter this latency stage from 6 to 12, where there is no erogenous zone. We're not deriving pleasure from anything with our body. Instead, we're focusing on like building friendships, basically, and like working on schoolwork. So that's a time where our focus kind of shifts outside of ourselves. And basically we have to, overcome that stage by successfully forming those friendships and kind of a sense of like autonomy. And then finally it ends with the genital stage, which is similar to the phallic stage because the erogenous zone is back to the genitals. We start to derive pleasure from that. And that basically that kind of ends development according to Freud. That if you get there, you've successfully overcome all the other stages, then you're going to have a healthy functioning ego and you're probably going to be a healthy functioning adult. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say about the stages of development. Any questions about that? Okay, again, not a ton of evidence for any of those really, but particularly the phallic stage, I think in particular, like not only is there not evidence for it, but there's lots of evidence against it. Yeah. Okay, because we're moving on from Freud on the next slide, so let me just make sure that there's nothing else I wanted to mention about him. I would say the main things that are still relevant from Freud, number one is the idea of the unconscious and the conscious. There is lots of evidence that yes, in fact, most of the processing that our brain does is unconscious. We don't have access to it. We're not aware of it. And that we kind of become conscious of things like after we've already made a decision, basically. So that part, I would say, is pretty well, is a sturdy contribution that he made. I would say, even though the specifics of this is not borne out, he was kind of the first to come up with this idea that the things that happen in your childhood are going to affect your personality and your healthy, functioning as an adult. And that general idea is definitely true, even though the specifics are very, very wrong. And then, you know, we'll maybe talk a little bit more about Freud when we talk about like therapy, because he was, you know, the founder of talk therapy and using therapy as a method to like treat various mental illnesses. So those are kind of the contributions that he made that still seem relevant today, basically.